Welcome to Abingdon-on-Thames, claimed to be the oldest town in all of England. Thought to have first been settled as long as 400,000 years ago, Abingdon today is a wonderful riverside market town in the south of the county of Oxfordshire, and is home to a wealth of captivating heritage on its charming streets. On this walk, we'll stroll through the centuries as we make our way around Abingdon's fetching town centre, but we begin on the historic marketplace, which is the site of one of England's most unusual traditions. According to local tradition, on special occasions such as coronations, jubilees and royal weddings, Abingdon locals pack into the marketplace beneath this building, the 17th century County Hall. Above the crowds on the roof of the County Hall, members of Abingdon's local government then throw thousands of traditional currant buns down onto the marketplace, which the lively crowd try to catch on a day of bizarre traditional fun. Now, the exact origins for this unusual tradition, which is thought to have been taking place in Abingdon for over 250 years, are uncertain, although the first recorded event was in 1760 upon the coronation of King George III, and so it's likely a simple gesture of goodwill towards the monarch of the day. We'll talk more about the bun-throwing tradition and the County Hall there when we return to the marketplace later on in our walk, but here we're looking up at the Church of St Nicholas, which was built over 850 years ago in 1170 AD. One of the oldest buildings in town, St Nicholas's has overlooked the marketplace as Abingdon has grown up over the centuries, the current market town having evolved in the medieval period on the outskirts of Abingdon Abbey, which was founded just a few steps away from here more than 1300 years ago in the late 7th century. Now, while the abbey was closed down around 500 years ago, St Nicholas's Church here is one of the last remaining buildings that formed part of the abbey which are still in use. Once upon a time the place of worship for St Edmund of Abingdon, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 13th century, the church also serves as a striking reminder of the historic importance of Abingdon Abbey, the entry to which we can see just here. One of the youngest features of the historic abbey, this gateway was built back in the late 15th century, with a large central archway through which coaches carrying travellers entered the abbey complex, having journeyed from afar to visit the monastery. However, following the dissolution of the monastery in 1538 at the hands of Henry VIII, the gateway's purpose began to change, serving as the town's first police station in the 19th century, with the rooms on the floor above us here used as Abingdon's Old Gaol, and later a popular venue for local functions and banquets. Nowadays, the gateway here stands as one of the most beautiful landmarks in Abingdon's town centre, and probably the best preserved relic of the old medieval abbey, which once spanned a vast area beside the River Thames in this area of town. Having passed through what was once the main entrance to the abbey, the monastery's main buildings were historically located to the left of the road that we're on now, but they're long since gone following the monastery's dissolution in the 16th century. However, to the right of this road, you'll still find a number of spectacular medieval buildings which belong to the abbey, and we'll now make our way to have a brief look at them. But first, to get a better understanding of exactly why an abbey was established here in Abingdon, let's take a look at a map to see where this ancient town is located. As we mentioned, Abingdon is situated in the south of the modern ceremonial county of Oxfordshire, just 6 miles south of the historic city of Oxford, and beside the mighty River Thames. More specifically, Abingdon lies on the confluence of the local rivers Och and Sturt with the River Thames, and the junction of these natural waterways was a key reason for the original settlement of this area by people hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now, the abbey here was founded around the year 676 AD, just a few yards upstream from the point where the Och and Sturt flow into the Thames, and here we can see some of its most complete remains. Behind this wall are 2 buildings, the stone-built structure known as the Chequer, built in the 1260s, likely as the office from which the whole abbey complex was administered. At over 750 years old, the Chequer is one of the oldest remaining buildings from the abbey, but just beside it we can see a beautiful building known as the Long Gallery, which was built in 1455, likely as a guest house for pilgrims who'd come to visit the abbey. While many of the Abbey's buildings fell into ruin after the dissolution, these structures appear to have been bought by a wealthy man named William Blacknall, who used them as a private residence while he operated the Abbey's former mills on the river nearby. Today, meanwhile, the remaining Abbey buildings have taken on a variety of different uses. Neighboured by the beautiful 16th century house that we're looking at here, the Long Gallery was once a brewery, but has now been beautifully restored as a historic site by the Friends of Abingdon Civic Society, while the Chequer Hall here is today home to Abingdon's Unicorn Theatre, a popular local playhouse opened in the 13th century building back in the 1950s. Making our way underneath the floorboards of the Unicorn Theatre, this alleyway through the old Abbey buildings leads us out onto Thames Street, named, as you'd expect, after the second longest river in Britain. The Thames, which flows for 215 miles across southern England towards the North Sea, was of course a crucial reason for the development of Abingdon through history, although Thames Street here doesn't actually lie alongside the Thames, rather a small waterway known as Mill Stream, which was dug by hand around 1,000 years ago to provide a flow of water which could power the corn mills at Abingdon Abbey. The corn mills were used by monks as a way to gain income to support the Abbey and their activities, and they continued to operate even after the Abbey's dissolution. The presence of this stream, crossed by a small footbridge, indicates the role that the Abbey played in the development of Abingdon, building important infrastructure like this to support the mills which brought wealth to the town. Also, just beneath where we're standing here, you'll find the mouth of the River Sturt, one of the two rivers which join the Thames at Abingdon. The other is the Och, whose mouth we'll visit later on in our walk, but the Sturt beneath us here is almost entirely invisible to the people of Abingdon, as it flows through man-made tunnels, or culverts, underneath the town centre's main streets, before it flows into the Thames here. Now the Thames proper, which we'll get a better look at later, is crossed here by the larger Abingdon Bridge, a busy road bridge that dates to 1927 in its current form, although before it there had been a bridge crossing the Thames here since 1422. As what may well be England's oldest town, there's centuries of history behind every landmark in Abingdon, and here we're passing by the Broad Face, a pub housed in a building of 1840, but which may have a history dating all the way back to 1734, thought to have been named after the broad face of the building overlooking the Thames, or, according to a more colourful theory, the swollen face of a man who either drowned in the river or was hanged at Abingdon's Old Gaol across the road from the pub. Looking across Bridge Street, busy with cars waiting to cross over the Thames, between the houses on the other side of the road you'll find Abingdon's huge old jail, opened in the 19th century, when, as we can see from this painting, it absolutely dominated the town's skyline. When the jail was in use, this building, the old county police station, was opened in the 1850s, although by the end of the 19th century, Abingdon's jail had become outdated, and today, the old jail has been converted into modern apartments. Now having crossed over Bridge Street from the Broadface pub, opposite the quaintly named Turn Again Lane here, we can see another historic inn, the Crown and Thistle. The pub takes its name from the union of the English and Scottish crowns, which occurred 2 years before it was opened back in 1605, and through the 17th and 18th centuries, the Crown and Thistle served as a busy stopping point for travellers on this, the main road running south from Oxford. As this was the main road through town, many of Abingdon's most important buildings were built alongside it, and across from us here we can see the Guildhall, home to the town council chambers and a complex of different buildings with a long history. Just in front of St Nicolas Church is the oldest building in the Guildhall complex, the former St John's Hospital, which was once part of Abingdon Abbey, and it flanks the other side of the gateway to the Abbey from the medieval church. Now of course, while the Guildhall plays host to Abingdon's local town council, historically Abingdon was home to the county council, but not for Oxfordshire. In fact, for a long period of its history, Abingdon was the county town of Berkshire, historically separated from Oxfordshire by the River Thames. And so that's why Abingdon's marketplace is home to the Grand County Hall here, which was built over 6 years from 1678 to 1683, although at the time of its opening, it was better known as the Market Hall. The reason? Well, while the rooms on the building's upper floor were used by the council, The ground floor here was designed as an open arcade where markets could be held under cover from the elements. As you'd imagine, as one of England's oldest towns, Abingdon is also home to one of the country's oldest markets, possibly having been established in the late 13th century or even earlier, and traditionally held on the marketplace here every Monday. The County Hall, once the meeting place for Berkshire's County Council, has today been converted into Abingdon's riveting town museum, which, as well as featuring exhibitions on the town's history, offers some lovely views over the marketplace, much like that you'd have when throwing buns down onto the crowds. Just down beside the County Hall, meanwhile, there stands the Punchbowl, yet another pub in this historic town, housed within a building that's thought to be around 4 centuries old. As a historic market town busy with trade for centuries, you'll find no less than 11 pubs in Abingdon's town centre, and here on East St Helen Street you'll find what's thought to be the oldest pub in this oldest town in England, the King's Head and Bell. The pub's history is said to date back to at least 1554, when it was a small coaching inn known as the Bell Inn. However, during the English Civil War of the mid-17th century, the old Bell Inn was visited on a number of occasions by none other than King Charles I, who's believed to have stayed here overnight and used the inn as a centre of operations during the war, Abingdon conveniently located just a stone's throw away from the King's wartime capital of Oxford. Perhaps due to its association with Charles, or for some other reason, the Bell Inn came to be known as the King's Head and Bell in the 18th century, and it grew in size over the decades into one of Abingdon's busiest coaching inns. Having made our way off the marketplace now, we're going to continue along East St Helen Street here, lined with yet more historic buildings, including this, Twickenham House, a gorgeous Georgian-era townhouse built in 1757 for Joseph Tomkins, part of one of Abingdon's most influential families at the time. Just a couple of doors along from the imposing Georgian townhouse, meanwhile, you'll find the most complete medieval house in Abingdon. The cream-coloured house in front of us was built nearly 600 years ago in 1431, and it today retains almost exactly the same appearance, the only major change over those 6 centuries being the gaping hole in the middle of the house, built by an owner of the 19th century, who knocked through the home's old hall. East St Helen Street's row of historic houses continues just next door meanwhile, this building known as Unicorn House, dating at its oldest to the early 17th century, when it was possibly opened as an inn. Soon after, Unicorn House became the private home of Thomas Medlicott, later an MP for Abingdon, and in 1688 he had quite an important guest in the form of William of Orange, who stopped off here during a seminal moment in British history, when he was making his way from the seaside town of Brixham in Devon towards London, where he was to be crowned King William III, deposing the previous King James II in what was known as the Glorious Revolution. Now there's even more to say about the rest of the houses here on East St Helen Street. In fact, just across the street from us, archaeologists have found evidence to suggest that this was the site of a Roman-era metalworks, signalling the presence of local industry taking place beside the Thames nearly 2,000 years ago. Despite this, however, Abingdon isn't thought to have been a prominent settlement during the Romans' occupation of Britain, although Roman settlers did make use of structures built by native Britons all the way back in the Iron Age, some of the earliest residents of the Abingdon area. That takes us all the way back to the beginning of the town's history, and we'll talk more about Abingdon's earliest origins later on. But here, we're now approaching St Helen's Church, Abingdon's second historic parish church. Established centuries before St Nicholas's, St Helen's Church here was founded as a parish church for the civilian settlement of Abingdon that existed outside the walls of the abbey, first built as far back as the 7th century AD on the site of a much older pagan shrine. That Anglo-Saxon church soon grew into one of the most important sites in the medieval town, and it was rebuilt on a much larger scale from the 13th century onwards. Since then, St Helen's has been regularly expanded and developed, the spire that looms above us here dating from a rebuild of the 1880s, one of the newest features in a church with centuries of history behind its notable architecture. In fact, St Helen's Church is famous for the fact that it's actually much wider than it is long, and we'll get a better view of that a little later on. But here in the churchyard we find Twitties, a row of almshouses built in 1706 to provide housing for the town's poor, and they take their name from Charles Twitty, a wealthy local man who left much of his fortune behind to the town of Abingdon. Twitties is one of 3 rows of almshouses in St Helen's busy but compact churchyard, which is actually unusually small given the size of the church here, a symptom of the fact that, for many years in the medieval era, locals weren't allowed to be buried in St Helen's churchyard, as the Abbey was in control of all burials at the time. For centuries, St Helen's Church regularly competed with the Abbey for the top status in medieval Abingdon, becoming locked in a number of rather intense disputes with the community of monks just a few streets away. But in the absence of making room for burials, the churchyard here took on a different purpose, as the home of these, the Long Alley Almshouses, which were opened in 1447. The gorgeous exterior that we can see today, meanwhile, dates from a refurbishment of the year 1605, an update to the Long Alley that makes it one of the most beautiful buildings in Abingdon today. But back when it opened in the 15th century, these almshouses were decidedly simple, their purpose of housing vulnerable members of the local community at the centre of focus. The almshouses were established by the Fraternity of the Holy Cross, a local company based at St Helen's Church, which in 1441 became the first company in Abingdon, separate from the Abbey, to gain a royal charter, giving it the rights to raise funds for its own projects without permission from the Abbey. Specifically, the fraternity's charter gave them the right to establish an almshouse for 13 poor, sick and impotent men and women, that being the Long Alley here, which was built just a few years later. Today, looking inside the Long Alley's fetching main walkway is like stepping back centuries in time. But amazingly, the building's main purpose actually remains the same all these years later, serving as part of the local Christ's Hospital and providing supported accommodation for elderly Abingdonians. On some special occasions, you can take a look inside the Long Alley's beautiful central hall as a visitor, but it, like many of the historic almshouses in this part of Abingdon, has remained an active part of the community even into the 21st century. Opposite the Long Alley behind the trees, meanwhile, are more almshouses, these known as Brick Alley, opened in 1720 by Christ's Hospital, which makes them the newest of the 3 almshouses in St Helen's churchyard. The presence of these active buildings in the parish churchyard certainly makes this a unique part of Abingdon's historic town centre, but it's also located in one of the more picturesque parts of the town, as the churchyard backs on to the River Thames. Much narrower here than it is further downstream in London, the Thames is tranquil as it flows past Abingdon, but the river also once played a crucial role in local trade for centuries. Here, we're passing by the Old Anchor Inn, a popular riverside pub that opened back in 1884, but its name points to the historic presence of river-borne commerce in this small slice of land, which is known as St Helen's Wharf. Today consisting of the pub, the churchyard and a collection of hospital buildings, St Helen's Wharf was once the point from which products produced in Abingdon would be exported and where imports would arrive to the town. In fact, for a long time in the late medieval era, St Helen's Wharf was one of the busiest points of trade in the upper reaches of the Thames, and its business brought great wealth to the merchants of Abingdon, who came to own many of the exquisite townhouses we saw back on East St Helen Street. As we look out across the river as it flows downstream towards London, a good 50 miles away from here, this is also the point where the Thames is joined by the smaller River Och, a 23-mile-long tributary whose confluence with the Thames here was of course one of the key factors for the original settlement of Abingdon thousands of years ago. The River Och is thought to take its name from an old Celtic word meaning young salmon. As you'd imagine, the name comes from the fact that salmon were once a common sight in the Och, as well as in the Thames, and the fish actually formed a staple part of local diets for riverside communities in the medieval era, although development along the Thames over the centuries has caused the salmon population to reduce significantly. Now though, having taken a look at the point where the rivers meet, we're going to walk back through St Helen's Wharf to make our way towards Abingdon's marketplace once again. But as we stroll along this path beside the River Och, let's now turn our minds back to the very earliest settlement of this area, the settlement that's claimed to give Abingdon the title of England's oldest town. Of course, little is known for sure about the area's prehistory. However, it's thought that the presence of the three rivers here, the Thames, Och and Sturt, convinced former hunter-gatherer humans to establish a more fixed settlement, the waterways providing plentiful water, food, and, as time went on, links with other human settlements around the region. As we mentioned at the start of our walk, this earliest settlement is believed to have taken place at least 400,000 years ago. And in the local museum, you'll find unearthed tools used by humans of that period on display today. But those were just the beginnings of Abingdon, and much later on in history, in the 37th or 36th century BC, people built a large causewayed enclosure here, a huge earthwork of ditches and banks that protected an open space which was often visited by people setting up temporary camps. However, it wasn't until the Iron Age, around 3,000 years ago, that Abingdon became home to what would be recognisable to us as a town, and we'll talk more about that later on. But we've now returned to the parish churchyard, dominated of course by St Helen's Church, which as we can see from this angle, is immensely wide, composed of 4 aisles and a central nave in the middle. Thought to be one of the widest churches in England, St Helen's unorthodox layout is simply the result of successive expansions of the parish church over the centuries, with extra aisles having been added to increase capacity rather than simply rebuilding it from scratch. The spire, however, was rebuilt on a number of occasions, but it always remained a soaring landmark that dominated this part of the town, and served as a symbol of the civilian community's power in contrast to the abbey. As we mentioned earlier, St Helen's Church and Abingdon Abbey were regularly locked in disputes in the medieval era, and on one occasion back in the 14th century, when the abbey had full control over not just burials but the whole local economy, the bells of St Helen's Church actually rung out across the town, not to signal the start of a church service, but as a call to the local townspeople to launch a coordinated attack on the abbey, spearheaded by a group of students from Oxford, and which led to a major riot in the town centre. Now, while the abbey had played a key role in developing Abingdon's trade and economy for centuries, its dominant presence in the town became widely unpopular, and ultimately the townspeople had the last laugh when Abingdon Abbey was closed down in 1538 during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries campaign. Having operated for nearly 1,000 years, however, Abingdon Abbey is probably the most important place to have ever existed in this town. But how exactly was it founded in the first place? Well, this takes us all the way back to the first origins of what we'd consider the modern town of Abingdon. Around 3,000 years ago in the Iron Age, Abingdon's riverside was home to a large oppidum, effectively a town surrounded by fortifications, and inside which people traded with one another. This oppidum was later taken over by the Romans, before the abbey followed roughly 4 centuries later, although the abbey wasn't actually first destined to be built here in Abingdon. According to legend, the abbey's origins begin with a man called Abba, who in the 5th century fled from war-torn Wiltshire to the southwest to live a quiet life in this region. Abba settled on a hill where he created a hermitage, and which then became home to a church that later led his isolated home to be christened Abingdon, meaning the Hill of Abba. But what was then Abingdon wasn't actually where we find Abingdon today, as the hermitage was actually located on top of a hill a few miles to the north of here. But in the late 7th century, roughly 200 years after Abba settled the area, there came Kissa, a member of the ruling elite in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, and he encountered the former hermitage and church. Kissa was sent to found an abbey. However, he transposed Abingdon to this location by the River Thames, where the abbey was established around 676 AD. And a few years later, a relative of Kissa, named Killa, also arrived here and established a separate nunnery, located on the site now occupied by St Helen's Church. That nunnery is long since vanished, while, as we've seen, much of the former abbey has disappeared, but for a number of later buildings. And so the story of the true origin of the town of Abingdon is undoubtedly clouded by the passage of time and the loss of its oldest landmarks. And you'll hear many more tales which provide a different, but equally possible explanation for the birth of this town. However, we now find ourselves on Abingdon's small high street, which is lined with a collection of mostly late Victorian buildings, as the majority of the houses which had previously stood on this street were destroyed in a fire of 1883. Today, the High Street is home to a collection of shops and pubs, including the Narrows here, housed inside Abingdon's old post office, and it takes its name from the fact that the High Street used to be extremely narrow, before being widened in the aftermath of the fire. Facing opposite the Narrows, meanwhile, is another pub, the Grapes Inn, which actually predates the fire of 1883, and which has for roughly 150 years been serving travellers on this road which leads out towards the west from Abingdon's town centre. But as we pass by the town's War Memorial, unveiled here in 1921, we're going to double back around and make our way towards the very centre of Abingdon once again, finishing our walk around the town on the marketplace in just under 5 minutes' time. And on the way back to the marketplace, we'll pass even more of Abingdon's plethora of pubs. Here we find the Blue Boar, which is believed to have been opened back in 1809, but it's housed inside a much older building of the 16th or 17th century. Much like the Crown Thistle over on Bridge Street, the Blue Boar is home to a large inner courtyard into which coaches would historically pull through this large doorway, offloading weary travellers who would stop for a moment for a drink or an overnight stay if there was space. And although it may only have been opened just over 200 years ago, the Blue Boar's position as one of the dozen or so pubs in the heart of Abingdon goes to show the enduring popularity of these inns even into the modern day. Abingdon has always been a good place to open a pub though, because apart from the wealth of passing trade through the centuries, the town was also once home to its own brewery, located inside the Long Gallery after the closure of the Abbey. And just a few steps down from the Blue Boar, there's the Black Swan, a slightly newer pub that's thought to have opened back in 1854. Certainly a boom period for Abingdon's hospitality industry, as the local population grew and the number of people travelling through the town increased as well. But despite being home to so many pubs in the rather small heart of town today, like many places around the country, Abingdon has also seen the closure of many of its other traditional taverns in the last 40 years, with no less than 16 local alehouses having shut their doors since the 1980s, many now converted into private houses or new shops. There must have been a time when there was nothing but pubs in Abingdon's town centre. But speaking of new shops, we now find ourselves on Bury Street, which certainly looks rather different compared with the rest of this oldest of English towns. Situated in the very centre of the modern town, Bury Street is a newly refurbished shopping centre completed in 2013 that modernised a development of the 1960s, and it's today home to a variety of your typical high street chains. While it's certainly an improvement on the previous development, Bury Street still feels a little out of place when compared with the rest of this gorgeous and historic town. But the street is home to an intriguing history of its own, as back in the Victorian era, this was the site of a collection of cottages, which were later replaced by a town centre school and Abingdon's huge old corn exchange, the loss of which, in the 1960s, was much maligned by Abingdonians at the time. But while Bury Street may have seen many of its old buildings come and go, it's fair to say that Abingdon, with its thousands of years of history, is home to its fair share of historic landmarks that have survived through all the ups and downs of the town's riveting life. Holding a strong claim to be the oldest town in England, Abingdon's thousands of years of enthralling history remain on clear display to this very day, from the traces of its medieval abbey to the beautiful parish churchyard and the wonderful marketplace here, home to one of England's most unusual traditions. But before buns start raining down on us from the county hall, it's here that we've come to the end of our walk around the wonderful town of Abingdon-on-Thames. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Abingdon to experience its incredible history for yourself sometime soon.